You don't wake up afraid that something will go wrong. You wake up afraid that nothing ever will, that your life will continue exactly as it is, smooth, functional, acceptable, and quietly not yours. Before you've even opened your eyes, there's a flicker of unease, the sense that the day ahead is already decided, not by you, but by something that learned long ago how to move your body, answer questions, and make choices on your behalf. And the most disturbing part is not that this is happening, it's that it works. You move through your morning with precision. You say the right things. You choose what makes sense. You feel what you're supposed to feel. And somewhere beneath that efficiency, a thought surfaces and immediately scares you into distraction. When did this become automatic? The fear doesn't come as panic. It comes as recognition. A quiet realization that you have become very good at living without being fully present inside your own life. You don't feel lost in the dramatic sense. You feel oriented, stable, reasonable. And that's what makes the suspicion so dangerous. Because if something were obviously wrong, you would fix it. But this feels like success. You are functioning. You are coping. You are adapting. And yet there is a pressure behind your chest that doesn't respond to logic. A subtle sense that whatever is driving you now is not the same thing that once made you feel alive. You start to notice how rarely your choices feel fresh, how often they feel inherited, how your opinions arrive already formed, your reactions already measured, your desires already filtered through what is acceptable, achievable, or admired. You tell yourself this is maturity, growth, responsibility. But if you're honest, if you slow down long enough to feel instead of explain, it feels more like something else has taken over the steering while you learned how to sit quietly and agree. And that thought is unsettling enough that you rarely let it finish forming. There is a grief you don't name, because naming it would require admitting that something was lost without a single dramatic moment to mark its disappearance. No collapse, no rebellion, just a long series of small adjustments. You learned when to soften, when to hide, when to stop asking certain questions. You learned which parts of you caused friction and which parts earned approval. And slowly, without anyone forcing you, you began to edit yourself. What frightens you now is not that this happened, it's that it felt necessary, that it worked, that it protected you. And protection always has a cost. You feel that cost in the strange emptiness that appears even when things are going well. In the fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure, in the sense that you are always maintaining something, even when you are alone, especially when you are alone. Silence has become uncomfortable because it removes the audience, and without the audience, the role starts to feel thin. So you fill the space, noise, tasks, screens, plans, anything that keeps you from sitting long enough for the deeper question to surface fully. Because you sense that if it does, it won't ask politely. What if the version of you that moves through the world, the one with a name, a history, a personality, is not who you are but who you became to survive? What if this identity is not false but incomplete? A structure built to keep you safe, not to make you whole. You can feel how quickly your mind tries to soften that idea, intellectualize it, turn it into an interesting thought rather than a dangerous one. But beneath that defense is a quieter fear. If this structure were to crack, you're not sure what would be left standing. And this is where the unease sharpens into something you can no longer ignore. Because the fear you're feeling doesn't behave like anxiety. It doesn't want reassurance. It wants attention. It feels intentional, as if something beneath your awareness has been waiting patiently for you to slow down enough to notice that you've been living from the outside in. This fear isn't here to be solved. It's here to signal that a question you've avoided for years is finally close enough to touch. And once you sense that, once you realize that this discomfort is not an interruption but an invitation, you also sense something else. That if you follow it, even slightly, the life you've been carefully maintaining may not survive unchanged. And that thought, more than anything else, is what makes you hesitate. At some point, quietly, without ceremony, you learned that being fully yourself carried consequences. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones, a raised eyebrow, a withdrawal of warmth, a moment where expression cost you safety, and so you adjusted, not because you were weak, but because you were attentive. You noticed what earned acceptance and what created distance, what made life smoother and what made it harder. You learned which parts of you could stay visible and which parts needed to be folded away, not destroyed, just postponed. And that postponement became a pattern. Over time, it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like personality. You told yourself this was just how you are: calm, agreeable, controlled, capable. But underneath that description is a quieter truth you rarely let surface. This version of you exists to prevent something else from being felt. You can sense it in the way you instinctively regulate yourself before anyone else has to, how you soften reactions before they fully form, how you translate raw impulses into acceptable responses. This isn't dishonesty, it's efficiency, a system designed to keep you intact in a world that rewards predictability. And it works so well that you've forgotten it's a system at all. You call it character, you call it professionalism, you call it being reasonable, but systems don't disappear just because you stop noticing them. They continue operating in the background, deciding what gets expressed and what gets suppressed, what feels possible and what feels dangerous. What's unsettling is not that you learned this, it's that you still rely on it, even now, even when no one is watching, especially then. Because without this internal regulation, there is a sense, vague but persistent, that something uncontained might surface, an emotion you don't know how to hold, a desire that doesn't fit the life you've built, a grief that would ask questions you don't have answers for. So you maintain the structure. You keep things measured. You stay within the edges of who you're allowed to be, not by others anymore, but by yourself. And the cost of that maintenance is subtle but cumulative. You feel it as tension that never fully releases, as a background fatigue that no accomplishment seems to justify, as a sense that you are always bracing for something, even on good days. You might tell yourself this is just adulthood, that everyone feels this way. And that belief is comforting because it turns a personal truth into a universal excuse. But notice how quickly you defend it, how quickly you move away from the possibility that this constant self-management is not neutral, that it is not free. Something in you knows that this internal structure didn't just organize your life, it narrowed it. It filtered not only pain, but intensity, not only chaos, but depth. And that's why moments of unfiltered emotion feel both magnetic and threatening. Why you're drawn to things that momentarily dissolve your sense of control, and why you immediately feel the need to recover afterward. Here's the part you avoid admitting. This structure protects you from feeling how much has been left unlived, not imagined, unlived. Because if you were to step outside the version of yourself that has kept everything stable, you wouldn't just gain freedom. You would also feel the weight of all the moments where you chose safety over truth, coherence over honesty, belonging over alignment. That's not a judgment, it's an accounting. And something in you resists that accounting fiercely, because once you see it clearly, you can't unknow it. This is why the idea of letting go feels so abstract and so frightening at the same time. Not because you don't know how to do it, but because you sense what would rush in to fill the space. The structure you live inside isn't just a mask you wear for others. It's the container holding back everything you were never given the space to become. And as this realization settles, another fear quietly takes shape, one you rarely articulate. If you stopped maintaining this version of yourself, even briefly, you're not sure who would speak first from underneath. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the structure intact. For now, you start noticing the cracks not during moments of crisis, but during moments that are supposed to feel fine. When nothing is wrong, yet something feels off. When your reactions lag behind your experiences, as if they've been pre-approved before you even arrive. This is where the structure begins to fail, not loudly but subtly. Because what you've postponed doesn't remain still. It presses, it leaks, it shows up sideways, in the irritation you can't justify, in the sadness that appears without a clear cause. In the patterns, you swear you've outgrown but somehow repeat anyway. The system that once kept you safe now requires constant reinforcement, and the reinforcement is costing more than you're willing to admit. You can feel it in the way you brace before speaking honestly, in how your body tightens before certain conversations, in how you rehearse reactions even when no one has asked for them. This isn't discipline anymore. It's containment. What you've avoided looking at is this. What you suppress doesn't disappear, it relocates. The parts of you that were postponed don't vanish. They wait, and waiting turns into pressure. Pressure turns into symptoms. You call them stress, burnout, lack of motivation. But those names are convenient. They allow you to treat the effects without touching the source. Because touching the source would mean admitting that the structure you depend on is also the reason you feel increasingly disconnected from your own life. The more you maintain it, the more foreign your own reactions begin to feel. You surprise yourself with how strongly you respond to small things. You judge others harshly for traits you can't tolerate in yourself. You feel drawn to chaos, intensity, or escape, not because you want to destroy your life, but because something in you is desperate to feel unfiltered, even briefly. This is where the real danger appears. Not that the structure will collapse suddenly, but that it will never collapse at all. That you will continue refining it, perfecting it, growing more functional and more hollow at the same time. Because the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to tell where the system ends and you begin. You start confusing stability with truth, control with maturity, and the thought that unsettles you most is the one you push away fastest. If this version of you is doing such a good job holding everything together, what has it required you to abandon permanently? Not temporarily, permanently. You feel time differently now, not as urgency but as erosion. Years passing without sharp edges. Experiences flattening into memory before they're fully felt. You tell yourself you'll get to the deeper things later, when there's more space, more clarity, more permission. But something in you knows that later is the structure's favorite word, because later keeps the accounting theoretical. Later keeps the loss abstract. And the truth is, the longer you wait, the quieter the postponed parts become, not because they've healed, but because they're learning you may never come back for them. This is the moment where discomfort turns into threat. Because once you see this pattern clearly, you're faced with an unbearable tension. Staying inside the structure feels like slow suffocation. Stepping outside it feels like free fall. And what frightens you most is not the fall itself, but the realization that the structure was never meant to be permanent, only transitional. Something you were supposed to grow through, not live inside. And now that you can feel it tightening, the question you've been avoiding is no longer abstract. It's immediate. How much longer can you keep living this way before the parts of you that were postponed stop waiting altogether? There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when you realize the ground you've been standing on was never solid, only familiar. The instability you fear isn't new, it's simply no longer being hidden from you. What's unsettling is how quickly your mind tries to negotiate its way out of this realization. It looks for frameworks, explanations, labels, anything that can turn this confrontation into a manageable idea. But this isn't an idea. It's an experience pressing upward, demanding to be lived rather than understood. You feel it when certainty begins to loosen, when the old definitions of who you are stop fitting as tightly as they once did. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. You start to sense how much effort has gone into holding yourself together, not emotionally, but structurally. How many internal rules you've followed without questioning who wrote them. How many instincts you've delayed until they became unrecognizable. And the fear sharpens here, not because something bad is about to happen, but because something honest might. You're no longer protected by ignorance. You can't unknow what you're seeing. The life you've been maintaining now feels fragile, not because it's failing, but because you're finally noticing the strain it's under. This is where resistance intensifies. You feel the urge to pull back, to return to the comfort of explanation, to tell yourself this is just another phase of introspection. But something in you knows that's a lie. Phases pass. This doesn't. This feels like a threshold. Because the more clearly you see the internal divisions, the parts that speak and the parts that were silenced, the harder it becomes to justify keeping them apart. Separation starts to feel artificial, painful, like holding your breath indefinitely. You may notice a strange duality emerging. On one side, fear. On the other, a quiet sense of inevitability. As if whatever you've been avoiding has been moving toward you this whole time, patiently, without urgency. It doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. It knows you can't sustain this level of internal division forever. And that knowledge is unsettling because it reframes your struggle. You're not fighting chaos. You're resisting wholeness. The old structure begins to feel smaller now, tighter. Not because it changed, but because you did. What once felt like safety now feels like confinement. What once felt like maturity now feels like restraint. And with that shift comes a new kind of fear. Not fear of losing control, but fear of what control has already cost you. You begin to sense that staying the same will require more sacrifice than changing ever could. More silence, more distance, more self-denial disguised as discipline. This is the point where the question you've been circling finally becomes unavoidable. Not who am I, but what have I been keeping myself from becoming? And the weight of that question doesn't come from its complexity, it comes from its timing. Because you can feel, in a way that doesn't need words, that there may not be endless opportunities to answer it honestly. The longer you delay, the more you risk turning this moment of awareness into just another thing you learned how to live around. And that is the real danger now. Not collapse, not chaos, but returning to equilibrium unchanged. Letting this realization fade into memory instead of allowing it to reorganize you. Because if you do that, something inside you will understand the message clearly. That even now, even here, it is still not allowed to speak. And that understanding doesn't disappear. It settles, it waits, and it changes you in ways you won't immediately notice. Until one day, much later, you realize that the distance you feel from yourself didn't appear suddenly. It grew, quietly, from a moment just like this one. At first, the signs are subtle enough to dismiss. You tell yourself you're just tired, just distracted, just thinking too much. But the pattern keeps repeating. Certain moments hit harder than they should. Certain silences feel heavier than before. You start to notice how often your reactions arrive late, as if something inside you is buffering reality before letting you feel it. And that delay is the clue, because nothing alive responds that way. Only something filtered does. Only something trained to hesitate. You begin to see how this internal distance shows up everywhere. In conversations where you say what makes sense instead of what's true. In decisions that feel correct on paper but empty in your body. In relationships where you're present, attentive, even caring, yet strangely untouched. As if a part of you is always watching from just behind the glass. You can't point to a single moment where this separation began, which makes it easier to pretend it isn't there. But now, it's harder to ignore how consistent it has become. What unsettles you is the realization that this distance has been interpreted as normal. You learn to call it composure, maturity, emotional intelligence, and in many ways it served you. It kept you from falling apart. It helped you navigate expectations. It made life manageable. But management is not the same as participation. And the longer you live this way, the more life feels like something happening near you rather than through you. You may notice how strongly you react to moments of authenticity in others. Not admiration, irritation, discomfort, a subtle tightening, as if their openness violates an unspoken rule you've been obeying for years. That reaction isn't accidental, it's protective. Because authenticity reminds you of something you've been postponing, something that doesn't fit neatly into your controlled interior world. And instead of letting that reminder reach you, you push it away, rationalize it, label it. Anything to avoid the unease underneath. But unease has its own intelligence. It doesn't shout, it persists. It waits for moments when your guard is down, when you're tired, alone, unoccupied. That's when it surfaces as a vague restlessness, a sense that something essential is missing but unnamed. You search for explanations. You blame circumstances. You look for external changes that might fix an internal fracture. And for a while that works, until it doesn't. Until the same feeling returns, sharper, less patient than before. This is when you start to sense that the distance you feel isn't between you and others. It's between you and yourself. Not because you don't know who you are, but because you've been living in a narrowed version of yourself for so long that anything outside it now feels foreign, risky, unstable, and yet paradoxically more real. The tension grows here, not between comfort and discomfort, but between familiarity and truth. What you're facing now isn't a choice in the ordinary sense. It's a pressure, a gradual realization that continuing as you are will require increasing levels of self-denial, more filtering, more explanation, more effort to keep the deeper currents from rising. And something in you is beginning to question whether that effort is sustainable, whether the cost of staying intact is slowly becoming the cost of staying alive. You may not have words for this yet. You may still try to smooth it over, intellectualize it, delay it. But the shift has already begun. The structure that once protected you is no longer invisible. You can feel its edges. And once you feel the edges, you can't go back to believing they aren't there. The distance you've lived with is no longer just discomfort. It's information. And it's pointing towards something you haven't allowed yourself to face yet. Not because you're incapable, but because facing it would change the relationship you have with yourself forever. At some point, the question stops circling and starts standing still in front of you. Not demanding an answer, just refusing to move out of the way. You can feel how much energy you've spent trying to outrun it, trying to improve around it, trying to become better without becoming more honest. And now that strategy no longer works, because the tension you're carrying isn't asking to be managed. It's asking to be acknowledged. The distance you feel is no longer subtle enough to explain away. It shows up as a dull ache beneath everything, a sense that your life is structurally sound but internally misaligned. This is where the illusion of a single, unified self begins to weaken. You start to notice that the voice guiding your daily life is not the only one inside you. It's just the loudest, the most practiced, the one that learned how to speak in ways that wouldn't disrupt the world around you. Beneath it are other voices, quieter, less articulate, but charged with emotion and urgency. They don't argue logically. They surface as moods, dreams, impulses, sudden waves of feeling that don't fit the narrative you've been maintaining. And the more you try to silence them, the more forcefully they return, as if insisting that being ignored is no longer an option. You may notice how your reactions to life feel increasingly out of proportion. Small frustrations feel unbearable. Minor disappointments linger longer than they should. Moments of joy feel fleeting, as if they can't fully land. This isn't because you're broken. It's because the inner split you've been living with is demanding resolution. Parts of you have been living in isolation for too long, and isolation creates pressure. Not explosive pressure, but the kind that slowly reshapes everything it touches. There's a fear that rises here, sharper than before. Not the fear of losing control, but the fear of discovering that control has been an illusion all along. That the identity you've relied on is not the core of who you are, but a surface arrangement designed to keep deeper material at bay. And if that's true, then the question becomes unavoidable. What have you been organizing your life around? Not values, not truth, but avoidance. Avoidance of feelings that were never allowed space. Avoidance of instincts that didn't fit. Avoidance of a depth you didn't know how to hold. This realization doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as destabilization. You feel less certain, not because you're regressing, but because certainty was never the goal of growth. Wholeness was. And wholeness requires contradiction. It requires allowing what was split off to return, even if it disrupts the structure you've been living inside. The discomfort you feel now is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something long exiled is approaching the surface. You may still hesitate. That hesitation is natural, because you sense that once this process begins in earnest, there will be no clean division between the parts of you that feel acceptable and the parts that feel dangerous. They will have to meet, and that meeting will not feel like relief at first. It will feel like disorientation, like losing the map you've been following for years. But beneath that fear is another awareness, quieter but steadier, that the map you've been using was never leading you where you needed to go. It was only keeping you from getting lost. And now, being slightly lost may be the only way back to yourself. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when you realize you are no longer searching for answers. You are recognizing something that has been watching you all along, not judging, not guiding, waiting. And the recognition is unsettling because it doesn't feel new. It feels remembered, as if what you're encountering now isn't a discovery, but a return to something you learned how to forget very early. The fear shifts here. It's no longer about losing control or dismantling the structure. It's about the quiet understanding that the structure was never meant to be the center of your life, only the scaffolding. You start to see how every internal conflict you've struggled with was not a flaw to be corrected, but a message that went unanswered. The exhaustion, the restlessness, the sense of distance, they were not signs that you were failing at life. They were signs that life was trying to reach you through the only channels left open. And once you see that, something changes in how you relate to yourself. Not dramatically, not instantly, but deeply. You stop trying to silence discomfort and begin listening to it, not for solutions, but for truth. This is where Jung's quiet insight reveals itself, not as a concept, but as an experience. That what you've been calling yourself was never the whole of you. It was a necessary fragment, a conscious center built to navigate the world. But life does not begin at the edges of what is controlled. It begins when what was excluded is allowed to return. Not all at once, not without resistance, but with honesty. You begin to sense that the fear you've been avoiding is not the enemy, it's the threshold. The signal that you are standing at the boundary between a life that functions and a life that feels real. There is no rush here, no declaration, no transformation you can point to and claim, only a quiet shift in orientation, a willingness to stay present when old defenses activate. A refusal to immediately explain away what disturbs you. A subtle courage to let unfamiliar emotions exist without correcting them. And in that space, uncomfortable, uncertain, unpolished, you begin to feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Not confidence, not happiness, but presence. You understand now why so many people live their entire lives without ever crossing this threshold. Because nothing about it is impressive. There is no applause for becoming whole, no external proof that you've arrived anywhere at all. And yet, something essential rearranges itself when you stop living as a fragment, when you allow the different parts of you to exist in the same room without one silencing the other. The fear doesn't disappear, but it changes its role. It becomes a guide, not a warning. And this is the quiet truth that settles in at the end of all this tension. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were organized around survival instead of truth. And life, real life, does not begin when everything feels safe. It begins when you are willing to face what has been waiting inside you without turning away. When you stop asking who you should be and allow who you are to reveal itself, slowly, honestly, without performance. That moment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand belief. It simply arrives. And once it does, you know, without needing words, that whatever comes next will finally belong to you.